This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, I'm thrilled to have one of my favorite guests, producer, writer, director Rocky Lang, return to StoryBeat today. Rocky's the co-author of Letters from Hollywood with archivist Barbara Hall, who was a recent guest on the show. I thought it would be great to get Rocky's point of view on writing the book and its unexpected journey to completion and publishing. Rocky's also the executive producer of a new Lifetime movie called You Can't Take My Daughter, starring Lyndsy Fonseca and Kirstie Alley. Maybe we'll get double lucky, and Rocky will also give us a few thoughts about the state of Hollywood today. To remind StoryBeat listeners, Rocky Lang's been involved in the motion picture and television business all his life. He's also the author of 9 books, including Letters from Hollywood, which is available at Amazon.com. It's also available at fine booksellers everywhere. It's so wonderful to welcome my good friend, Rocky Lang, back to the show. Rocky, thanks so much for being with me today.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and thanks for reaching out.
So, I want to talk briefly about the book. Obviously, covered a lot of it with Barbara, but I'm curious right off the bat, you put a letter in here from your father, Jennings Lang, to H.N.
Right.
Swanson. Explain to the listeners who H.N. Swanson was, and tell us a little bit about your dad and why you thought this, because I can tell you why I think so, but I want to know why you thought this was a great letter to put in the book.
Well, Swanee, as he was called, was a very famous lit agent back in the day, and he represented, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein. And I've got actually some wonderful letters from Hemingway to Fitzgerald that was in the Swanson archive.
Right.
Just really a pillar in Hollywood. And so that was what my dad wrote to, and the genesis of the entire book came out of that, finding that letter. And one day I returned home, and there was a letter from the Academy addressed to me, the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. And in it, the cover letter said, "Dear Rocky, you won't remember me, but I used to be the assistant librarian at the American Film Institute in 1980 when you were a directing fellow there." He says, "I'm now the acquisitions archivist at the Margaret Herrick Library, which is the library of the Academy, and I discovered this letter, and you might be interested in it." And I turned the page, and there was this letter from my father, written to Swanson in 1939. My dad was 24 years old. He had just come off a train from Brooklyn with maybe $100 in his pocket, and he was looking for a job as an agent. And my dad went on to be a very successful agent in Hollywood, representing Bogart and Joan Crawford and a number of other luminaries, and ultimately became a studio executive with MCA and Universal, and then became a producer of 35 films, including Earthquake, the airport movie, Slaughterhouse-Five, gave Clint Eastwood his first directing gig with Play Misty for me, and was instrumental in putting Steven Spielberg on the Sugarland Express, which was Steven's first feater film.
So in other words, he had a little.
Dad. So that letter inspired me to call my agent and say I wanted to do a book on Letters from Hollywood, and then I realized that I couldn't do it by myself, and I needed someone who really knew the archival system in the United States, and that was Barbara Hall. I was introduced to Barbara Hall, and she came on the project with me and did just a fantastic job. I couldn't have done the book without her.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what that letter meant.
Well, okay, so now you're telling me something great that I didn't know. I might have missed it when I read it, but this is what started the whole book, is this letter itself.
Yes, this letter really started it, because after I got the letter, I was so moved. I took Howard Prouty, the acquisitions archivist, out to lunch to thank him, and he then took me into the archives of the Herrick Library, which is just immense. It's got, I think, over 12 million photos alone, and God knows how many other millions pieces of artifacts, production files, budgets, letters, whatever it is, poster art, and then Barbara and I wind up combing the country in archives all over the country for other letters for our book.
Well, it's interesting, Hollywood is clearly filled with people who are famous. Celebrity is part and parcel of the backbone of Hollywood. But it requires huge numbers of people like your father, who is well known within the industry but not really known to the general public, to make it work. What I find really instructive about this letter, and I'm not sure that this letter would work in today's environment, but he's audacious in approaching H.N. Swanson and coming at him almost as if he should be in the position already, and he's 24 years old.
Well, that was what struck me a lot about this letter, because I obviously knew my father. My dad was, I think, 42 when I was born, and so he was, well established at that point. But the personality of my father that I knew, and we were very close, was evident in this letter when he was 24 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I could see his soul, I could see his passion, I could see his ballsiness, I could see his humor. So all of the sort of the parts of the personality that I remember my dad having were evident in this letter when he was just forming who he was as a man. And interestingly enough, as I went across to the country to get rights to the letters to put in the book from the family members were struck in the same way I was, is that we could hear the voices of our loved ones through the letter writing,
Mm-hmm.
which is lost to today's generation.
It is.
And because the rights to the letter are with, the copyright of the letter is with the family or the estate of the person who wrote the letter, not with the owner of the letter, not with the person who possesses a copy of the letter. And so by going around and getting the rights to, Sinatra and, Hepburn and Bogart and all the people in the book, I had to connect with their family. And so that was really emotional for me and a great journey.
Yeah, I'm sure it was, and I want to cover the rights part of this in a moment. But before we get to how the challenges of getting rights to all these things, you told me earlier that this book resulted in many unexpected twists and turns in the journey. Can you give us some examples of what you went through?
Well, I don't know if twists and turns is the right definition.
Correct me for sure.
More with surprises and effort, and
Mm-hmm.
such as letters that we couldn't find the estate holder. In some ways, I had to bring in a private investigator and go into sort of the deep estate files and wills and trusts and whatnot to find the people along the way. And then also what was really fascinating is some of the great stories that the sons and the daughters of the icons would tell me that were quite incredible about how things were cast and who was having an affair with who, and just these amazing tales that go on behind the scenes of Hollywood, which
Mm-hmm.
are obviously they're not in the book. And I guess one of the other surprises is something I'm sort of hesitant sometimes to talk about, but I'm winding up talking about it more, is that we found a letter from Gilbert Roland, the silent movie star who transitioned into talkies.
Right.
And he wrote this wonderful letter to Clara Bow. And Clara Bow was in a psychiatric facility later in her life, and Roland writes this great letter reminiscing about their love affair and their movies they made, including The Plastic Age back in the silent days. And it's a very tender, wonderful letter. So I had to go and find the rights to Gilbert Roland's letter, and I hired an investigator because I couldn't find the daughter. And it turned out she, was under the radar but living 10 minutes from me. So when I called her and I said, would you give her permission for this letter after I'd emailed it to her, she said, I would be happy to, but it's very important that I see you face to face. And so I was curious about this, but always happy to meet people. So I called David Sten, who wrote the biography Running Wild, which was the story of Clara Bow. And so I said, David, why does she want to meet me? And he started laughing, and he said, well, who do you think her aunt was? Or who do you think her mother was? And I said, I don't know. She said, well, Constance Bennett, the actress. Well, it turns out Constance Bennett is Joan Bennett's sister. And Joan Bennett and my dad were having an affair in an apartment across from MCA, which became the genesis for the movie The Apartment by Billy Wilder.
Oh, wow.
And so Joan Bennett's husband, Walter Wanger, ambushed my dad and Bennett in the MCA parking lot and shot my dad, and the rumor was my dad was shot in the balls. And that stayed the rumor until I was born to, many years later after my dad had married my mom.
Right.
And so David said, Jillian Rowland's going to want to know if your father was really shot. I said, oh, come on, why would she want to do that? Well, that's actually what happened, is at the lunch, she asked me if Walter was accurate. I told her, no, he wasn't accurate because I'm here talking to you. And she laughed, and then she signed the release, and we became friends. And she's been a participant in many of the other the activities we've had, and read her dad's letter. And it turned out to be a great friendship that I have with Jill Rowland now. So that was quite a surprise.
Is there any other stories that are kind of like off the charts, interesting and funny?
I don't know that there's anything really, really funny. I think that there are some letters we found that, I thought we wouldn't get the rights to. I mean, there's a letter that we have from Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist, the famous gossip columnist, and she writes this letter to a silent movie actress, a good friend of hers named Eileen Pringle. And the letter, and paraphrasing the letter, is that Hedda talks about the film Citizen Kane before it was released because she'd seen in a preview, and she talks about how foul this movie is and the director will never work again, and she just destroys the film and everything about the film, and so I now obviously we know what Citizen Kane became historically, so I had to reach her granddaughter who was a survivor of that family. And I thought there's no way that she was going to sign off on this letter because it makes your grandmother look like an idiot.
Right.
And turns out the granddaughter really cracked up about the letter. She thought it was hysterical. She thought her grandmother was a kook, and great stories about her. And so she signed off the letter. So, and then I didn't think we were going to get the Tom Hanks letter either because first of all, Tom's alive, and he's Tom Hanks, and. But when he saw the letter that we showed him, which was a letter to George Roy Hill, the director of The Sting and Butch Cassidy and a number of other films, and in that letter, basically, Tom, at 17 years old, is telling George Roy Hill all the reasons why he should be hired as an actor, and it's quite hilarious and self-deprecating. And so that was a letter that I didn't think we were going to get. And it turned out to be wonderful. And actually, Jane Fonda had the same reaction, and obviously she's alive, and she found, we sent her a letter that her father, Henry Fonda, had written to director William Wyler on the day that Jane was born, coming from Jane, announcing herself to the world and telling Wyler that she wanted to be an actress. And so, those were fun sort of stories behind it.
I love the
that's sort of it. There are other things down the road, but
I love the sign off.
That for another episode.
Sure. I love
the letters that didn't make it.
The letters. Well, that should be your sequel. That's your second book.
Yeah, the reason they didn't make it is they were revealing things that we felt were troublesome for us to put in the book.
Well, I wouldn't call this book in any way controversial.
No, we didn't want to be. We wanted to be a tribute to the men and women who made Hollywood, who built it in the 20th century, and to be a reflection of culture too. And that's why, as you go through the book, you're dealing with Depression area and World War II, and the Korean War, and the production codes and censorship and blacklists and all these other things that sort of ran parallel to the evolution of the film.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the beauty parts of the book is it reveals the human characters behind the people that we think are something other than what they are because we know them as the characters in the movies, but they are in fact humans.
Yes, and I think that sort of revealed itself as we started to look through the 1,000 or so letters that we had found. Barbara finding most of them. And as we chose letters that we loved, we sort of realized, as we were pulling these letters out, that there was this human connection, and there was this vulnerability to the people who were writing, and there were the same sort of fears and anxieties, hopes that we have today with our own lives, and they were evident in a lot of these letters and quite wonderful and touching.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to comment on the Tom Hanks letter briefly, that I love the way he signs this letter. He signs it as your good old buddy, Thomas J. Hanks. That's just fantastic.
Yeah, no, well, you can see Tom's personality
all through it.
Again, like similar to my dad, Tom was not an actor. He was a kid. He wanted to be in the movie business, and in this letter, you completely see sort of the silliness and the twinkle in the eye and the goofiness that Tom has today, and that we've seen in his parts and sort of his interviews and whatnot. And it's quite wonderful to see him as an unformed, complete man at an age where he's just sort of evolving out of being a teenager into adulthood.
I'm gonna do
desiring very much to be in the movies, and so the approach he took with Hill is incredibly funny. I mean, there's a ton of laughs in that letter.
I'm gonna do one quote from it. It says, "Let's work out the details of my discovery. We can do it the way Lana Turner was discovered. Me sitting on a soda shop stool. You walk in and notice me, and bango, I'm a star." Now that's both very funny and quite prescient in a way.
It's true, and as you know from the letter, it goes on with a lot of other bangos of all these scenarios of where George will discover Tom, and they get funnier and wilder, and as you get through the bangos. So yeah, wonderful.
It is,
and it just shows you that Tom has a sense of humor about himself, and when he got the letter. I had a release in my hand the very next day. There was no delay. He just signed it and said, basically, good luck. And, conversely, getting back to stories about the book, is that I particularly ran into a number of gatekeepers. And a story, the story about the gatekeepers is that, we found a letter from Francis Coppola to Sam Goldwyn about "You're a Big Boy Now."
Mm-hmm.
And so I called Francis's attorney a number of times and emailed, and never got a return phone call. I called and emailed up to Zoetrope to his production people to try to get him to see the letter, and nobody returned my calls. And so I called Fred Fuchs, who produced a movie, a 4-hour miniseries with me at CBS 10 years ago, and he worked with Zoetrope, and my production partner was at Zoetrope on that film. And I said, are you in touch with Francis? I've got this letter. I'd love to get it to him. And he says, no, I'm not, but you should call the family archivist, because I told him all my problems. So I sent the letter to the family archivist, and I got a call back from the intern, who's 22 years old.
Right.
And the intern reads the letter. He goes, oh, my God, this is a fantastic letter. I mean, I only went it over to Francis's office. He emails me back in 5-10 minutes. He says, Francis loves the letter. Send the release. He'll sign it. And can he have a copy? And, so all the gatekeepers were out there trying to, make a decision that Francis wouldn't be bothered with this. But when Francis saw the letter, he not only signed the release that afternoon, but he got the letter, hanging in his office, from what I understand. And, on the reverse side of the gatekeepers is that because my dad had worked at Universal for 35 years, I thought I could get into their library, and because it's a closed library to researchers.
Sure.
And so I got a lot of roadblocks from the people who run that library. And so a good friend of mine said, oh, well, you should contact Jeff Shell, who's the chairman of Comcast, the top guy. So I, was put in touch with Jeff. He says, oh, my God, I love this. You should definitely be in it. And it got passed over down to Ron Meyer in an email that, president of Universal, oh, this is a great idea. Universal should be involved. Ultimately, it trickled down to the man who had been, stonewalling me and blocking me. Very nice, very apologetic, but not doing anything. And he writes, oh, what a great idea. We should help you. And so, it's two sides of the gatekeeper, coming in through the bottom and coming through the very top. And so there are a lot of those kind of, situations in trying to clear these rights that I was facing.
So was that the most challenging rights clearance that you had to go through, or is there something even more
There are
challenging?
There are a lot of rights issues. Most of the time, I'd say that 90% of the time is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few institutional situations that were difficult. We had a sort of a nutty letter we found from Randolph Hearst, and I think it was written to, I don't remember. It might have been written to Jack Warner when Marion Davies left to come to Universal. And
this is the old man, William Randolph Hearst.
What?
The old man, William Randolph Hearst. Is that what you mean?
William, yeah. And Hearst was, advocating for Warner to have her play more dramatic roles because she'd made her, name sort of a comedian.
Sure.
And so the Hearst organization killed it. They didn't want anything about Hearst in the book, and so that institutions like that sometimes, hit us down. And then there was a weird one, which we ultimately got, is that we have a great letter from Paul Newman to Ray Stark, and it's really a funny letter. And so I contacted the Newman family because Paul had done a couple of movies for my dad, way back in the 70s.
Right.
I didn't know the family other than Joanne, and she's not well, and Joanne Woodward. And so I contacted one of the daughters, and she said, I love the letter, I love the idea of the book, but we don't have the rights because, pretty much 2 weeks before Dad died, he changed his will and he signed up all the likeness and images and everything else over to Bob Forrester. And Forrester was his business partner in Newman Organics, which, by the way, Nell Newman created, who was then fired after Paul died. And so it became a real sort of battle within the family and the Forrester group. And Nell said, Nell Newman said, I don't think they're going to give you the rights, and they were really tough about it. Until finally I sent a letter saying, look, I'm only trying to keep Paul's image alive, and this is a wonderful thing, and there's no monetary gain for me, and so I made this point, and ultimately the legal team at Forrester gave us the rights to use the letter, but it was more difficult than it needed to be.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. It took a long time. How many years did it take to gather all the rights and the letters?
We were 3 years on the project.
That's a lot of time, effort, and energy for sure. And I'm sure you laid out a certain amount of money, like you say, you hired detectives and so on.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend going into the publishing business in this way. I mean, we got an advance that for books like this was a decent advance.
Yeah.
But we spent the entire advance on our travel
Sure.
to various archives around the country and copying fees, Xerox, legal fees. We took out an errors and omission, insurance policy on the book. So, by the end of the day, we didn't make any money, but, the book is on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal.
It's gorgeous.
The AP, Vanity Fair, they're all on the best holiday book lists and have been reviewed incredibly well. And there's been a lot of fun in it and positive impact from the book. So that was worth a lot.
Yeah, I think anybody that loves Hollywood will absolutely love this book. There's no question. Tell us for a moment or two about how you and Barbara collaborated on the book. How did you divvy up your responsibilities?
Well, at the very beginning, as I came up with this idea, I think we all have ideas, and then it's just execution on
Sure.
if you're going to do the idea and how the work that goes into it. And so, being in the business as a producer and also as a director and writer, I know that some roles are better delegated to certain people to do because they're more knowledgeable. So I knew right away that I did not have the background, at the level. I've done a lot of research in my writing, but I didn't have the ability or the knowledge to dig into archives and state files and whatnot. So I asked Howard Prouty, the man who had originally sent me my dad's letter,
right.
Who he would recommend, and he recommended Barbara, who had 30 years in the business in archival research and as a historian, and really this is her life. And so when we were introduced, she had never had a book published, and I had 9 done, and so I said, look, I'll share credit with you, but you're going to have to do most of the research or teach me how to do it. So Barbara became the lead on finding the letters, and even when I would go across the country to find letters, Barbara would give me sort of a finding aids and directions to where I could find Joan Crawford's file or where I could find Vincent Price's file, so I wouldn't be sort of lost in the Library of Congress, So she was incredibly helpful in doing all of that. And where I came in when doing all the clearances of the rights, and also I found a number of letters that I tracked down on my own that are in the book. So Barbara did most of the finding of the letters, and I did most of the clearing of the rights. And I've done I've been in charge of marketing and publicity on the book as well. So it worked out really nicely, and it was a great collaboration.
Did you both sort of share in the writing of the interstitial work?
We did to some extent, but I would say that Barbara did 90% of it because the original concept, even maybe more than that, but the original concept that I had on the book and the sale of the book is that there would be the letter, and then there'd be sort of a longer, a page or two of interpretation that would be more in the line of the way that I write. But because we found so many letters, and our editor said, no, it's got to be caption-based. And so now you're in a place of really not creative writing, but definition writing
Sure.
of what the letter means.
Sure.
So as Barbara's a historian, that's what she does,
Mm-hmm.
and that was I wouldn't say it was easy for her, but it was certainly easier for her than for me.
Sure.
And she did an amazing job on it.
Yeah.
You're basically writing 137 paragraphs.
Yeah, she did. Well, you both did a terrific job. I mean, the book is very clear in what those, those explanations of the letters and how they came to be and so on, and some of the backstory. Just excellent. Just really revealing in a way that I've been studying Hollywood my entire life, and I've never seen anything quite like it. It's always, it's either Hollywood books tend to be either very dense or just lightweight, but not a lot in between, and this is right in the sweet spot where you're getting
It
really
was a
good
great,
stuff.
Great team effort. I mean, not only with Barbara and me, but our publisher Abrams Books.
Mm-hmm.
The book is a gorgeous book.
Gorgeous.
And the whole Abrams team, the editors, the art designers, the product layout people, the marketing people, they all were, we were all part of a team on it, and it just turned out great. I mean, we could never have expected the success on it.
Well, I wish you a ton of luck on it on going forward. Let's talk for just a moment about Hollywood today, because I know since you first got into the business, it has changed in major ways. You're the executive producer of a new Lifetime movie, and tell us about what that movie's about. It's called You Can't Take My Daughter.
Yes, it's another one of the great titles that are chosen by studios to basically tell people what the movie is about, which goes to the bigger question. This is a story that I had actually found, a true story, about 7-8 years ago, about a woman who was raped after graduating law school, and she became pregnant, and the rapist came back when she was pregnant, second time, and threatened to kill her. And she, in a panic at that time, it was during Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. She ran, and she wound up having this baby from the rapist, and she runs to Florida and settles there, and builds a life there, and then 11 years later, 7, 8, 10, 11 years later, the rapist shows up in Florida wanting custody of the kid, or co-custody of the kid. And it was crazy, and in that time the law was that you could be a rapist, but didn't mean you were the biological father, doesn't mean you're a bad dad. And no one had ever won a case in this situation, and because she had law experience, she and another lawyer basically formed a defense and wound up winning that. And that Debbie Wasserman Schultz came into the picture, and who was then a congresswoman from Florida,
Mm-hmm.
and they changed the law, and that law became a template for many other states afterwards. And so that's what the book was about. That's what the story was about. And then I tried to pitch it 7-8 years ago. I couldn't sell it. And then an executive who remembered the story and had passed on it years ago called me up and said, "Is that story still available?" And I said, "I'll check." And so I stayed in touch with the woman, the life rights holder, and she said, "Yeah." And so did another option, and ABC came in as my partner, and we sold it to Lifetime, and the movie, from what I'm told, it's going to be on in January. I don't have a date yet.
Right.
But so that was it. I ultimately wasn't that involved with production after development, because it just happened to fall during the whole book launch and the whole promotion
Sure.
across the country. And after 3 years, that was my choice to spend the time there.
Well, we also
my partner did really produce the movie.
Sure.
I'm the executive producer, or one of the executive producers.
We
which
also
is part of what Hollywood is today.
Yes, well, that's what I was going to say.
credit,
We
but
also know that in Hollywood, it's not uncommon for people at various stages of production, pre-production, and so on, to be involved and then not involved. That's not uncommon at all.
No, it's a little bit uncommon for me, because in the movies that I've produced, I've been pretty hands-on
Right.
on them, and in this one, it was a different circumstance where I knew I was, once they said production to be in the fall, I knew that I was not going to be available, and Lifetime likes to really only send one producer to set, and my partner Linda Berman actually she has a lot more experience on set than I do, especially in this area, and she's just a fantastic producer and a fast person, and so it was very much in good hands. And I saw a cut of the film last week, and I thought it's pretty good. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of these sort of true life stories because I think they get watered down, especially when there are important themes in it. But I was pretty happy with the first cut, and so we'll see what it turns out to be.
Well, for sure. Tell me about some of the challenges that you find in Hollywood today that are very different from when you first started. What are the big differences?
Well, I think in some ways, generationally, you see it in music and you see it in film. Is that, and I'm just setting this off this way, is that the older generation thinks that how they made movies was better than the newer generation, and people thought the old music is better than new music, and now we listen to rap and we compare it to our time and rock and roll, and we're trying to figure out like what that is versus what we liked, and so there's all of that happening on a cultural level, and you have to, as you get older, you have to accept that the world is changing and younger people come in and they have a different vision, a way they want to do it. So I'm accepting of that. On the other hand, I think that similarly, in the same way that the news divisions of networks when we came up were not in the entertainment division. They were autonomous and weren't expected to make money.
Right. And
as multinational corporations came in and 24-hour news cycle came in, they became segmented, and that's where we are today with Fox and MSNBC, and they appeal to certain people. So in the movie business, as we've evolved, also these big companies have come in. And what has happened, at least in the film world, is the original idea is almost impossible to set up unless you are Tom Hanks, who finds something. So all those great writers and directors that we saw in the 70s, whether Scorsese and Coppola and that group, that were doing really interesting films in the 1970s. There's not a pathway to doing those films. The spec script market was very big, where people would write scripts and they would go on to market, and you get all these great ideas for these great films. It became sort of legendary. And then today, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, they are event-oriented films, or they're sequels or prequels, or derived from Marvel Comics, and there are these very expensive films that are done by the big studios. And so there's not the ability for the original thought to find its way to make a movie. On the other hand, we have premium cable, and we didn't have premium cable in the old days. So a lot of the great writing, the great ideas,
that's where it's going,
are moving over, have moved over into the Netflixes,
sure,
and HBOs, and the Amazons of the world. So we're seeing some of those films finding their way there. And what's fascinating to me is that my dad in 1974 did Earthquake, and actually shot in 73, out in 74, and he billed that film in all the ads an event. And that term, an event, had never been used before to promote a film. Now it's used on everything.
Sure.
It doesn't matter. An event, it's kind of Tuesday night, an event. And so my dad felt that you needed to give an audience something more to get them into the theaters. And so Sense-Around was developed around, Earthquake. And he thought that, looking towards the future, he thought, people have to get in their cars, drive to a movie theater, buy the tickets, buy the popcorn, buy everything, park their car, all this stuff, drive home, that there needed to be a reason to get into that world and do that. And, lo and behold, that's where we are today. We have to see, Superman 17, on the big screen, to see all the effects and hear the amazing Dolby surround sounds. And so it has become an event. And so that's the frustration today, because the really good writers, or the writers with something to say, for the most part, don't have a key to the kingdom.
Right.
And that is the saddest part, because for the most part, great movies don't get made.
Well, do you think that movies, this is where I think it's going, I think movies are going to become much like books in a similar way. Your book, a coffee table book, a beautiful book like that, is always going to be published and welcome. But the ordinary books are all going over to digital. And movies are in a similar way, I think, are becoming all big, spectacular, as you say, event movies, and that the really intelligent stuff, the smart stuff, the long form stuff, is all going to be on Netflix and
well, I think we're
HBO.
seeing that right now, and I think that readership. I don't remember the stats, but each year readership goes down, and down, and because we live in this world of immediate need to get information, and so to actually sit down and commit to spending a couple of days, 7, 8 hours, 9 hours reading a novel or a book, a nonfiction book. I mean, you don't get the younger generation doing that. Again, for the most part, my kids do, but my kids grew up on a writer, and so they grew up in that world. But for most people, they don't, and so I think we're going down that path, and I think also it has to do with our education system, and we've been sort of dumbed down to the easiest road.
Yeah, I agree.
You go back and read some of the papers of even our founding fathers and the thoughts that they had, and you look at that and the language that they used, and and you realize that young people today, and they don't have those skills, or even or it's not built into them to be curious enough to find them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just going to go down and down and down. I mean, I really do. I think it's I'm fortunate. Unfortunately, I lived at the tail end of it, what I predicted to be the end of it, but at least in the mainstream way.
Well, that I teach screenwriting here in Pittsburgh, and one of the things that we notice in our program is we've got people that want to be writers, but they don't seem to want to be readers. And you've got to be a reader to be a writer, I think. And you certainly must know movies. You got to know genres and all the rest of it. But you certainly have to understand how to put words into sentences that make ideas. And
yes, you have to be a reader to be a writer. There's no question. You just inherently learn language and thought, and how to structure a piece and all of that. In fact, it's fascinating. Like even in my own family, I see some of the papers. I'm asked with some of the papers to help them with the papers, and I realize that some of their papers are, very simplistic. Not all the kids, but a couple of kids. They're very simplistic.
Sure.
And so, and they haven't read. They didn't. These are my stepchildren. They didn't grow up in a world where books were really pushed, and so they're now in college, and I don't think some of these papers they don't have the skills to do this. So I'm trying to catch them up and help them out. And conversely, there's my stepdaughter is she's at Penn, and she reads a lot, and she's very interested and curious, and so but I think that's rare. I mean, from the young people that I know, and I throw it out. It's really interesting when we sit around and say, "Hey guys, what books are you reading?" And there's nobody's read a book.
Yeah, it's rare and becoming rarer. So, all right. So now let's assume that you are in today. Last couple questions. That you're sitting there in Hollywood today, and you are in your 20s or 30s, or you're struggling to make it into the business, and you're trying to sell a script, and you're not really getting very far. Do you have any thoughts as to the way to stick it out? How should people think about it? When should they abandon a work?
Well, I would say if you're confident the work is good, you never abandon it. You may put it asleep, send it to be asleep for a while, such as in my Lifetime movie that was gone. It was asleep for 7 years before it awakened. I actually just sent a script out. I was with a meeting the other day, and somebody said, "Oh, LeBron James has this new company, and he's looking for scripts in this genre and whatnot." And I thought about what I had in my library, and I'd actually written a script, I think, in maybe 1990. But it's a period piece, so it hasn't gone out of date because it took place in the 40s.
Right.
And so I pulled that script out and I sent it out. Maybe it'll be interesting to him. Maybe it won't be interesting to him. So you never really give up on material that you believe in. You just may have to put it away because new administrations come in. They're presidents and vice presidents and development people. They're changing every couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
It's a revolving door. Sometimes you can change the title if it's been exposed, and change some things around it to sort of have another shot at it. So I don't think you abandon material that's good. You may abandon material that you're convinced after sending it out that the reactions have been so negative that there's a consensus that the script is not very good, you may want to consider why that happened, and either if you want to change it or not. But I'd say the thing about Hollywood, actually, in my first book that I had done, How I Broke into Hollywood for HarperCollins, where we interviewed a lot of people in Hollywood from the very top levels to craft service people about how they broke in. We saw time and time again that the successful people never gave up. It wasn't like they had to be, they wanted to be in the business. They had to be in the business. It defined who they were, and they were going to do everything they could to get in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw that time and time again with successful people. And so I would encourage the young person to not give up. But also I would tell them to be smart about it. Whereas, like when I was young, I would write and do things that I just were interesting to me because I was curious and I wanted to write it. And there was a bigger opening to go in with those types of projects. Now you have to evaluate. Like, okay, so who are the buyers? What are they looking for? Is this a piece of IP that I found that will give value to it? Can I get an actor attached? Can I get some money attached? What are you going to do to give yourself a leg up, as opposed to just coming in with like a young writer without an agent saying, hello, I got the script here. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, back in the day before there was video, it was the same problem for directors because you couldn't make your own videos like you can today and cut something.
True.
So you're trying to be a director, and they say, what have you done? I've said nothing. So you need a film to get a director, and you need a studio to give you the money to make a film. And so what are you going to do? So there was a different frustration back in the day. I had a meeting with Sidney Pollack before he passed in 2008 about some projects we were talking about, and we got into that sort of thing about new projects. And he said, if I get a DVD, in those days it wasn't digital so much, when I get a DVD from a young filmmaker, it takes me 2 seconds to throw it into the into the machine. I'll take a look at 5 minutes of it, and I'll know in 5 minutes if the guy has a good idea. If he has a good idea, I might have a meeting with him. So kids today have that ability to go out and actually do it.
And just even on their phone, they can use their phone.
Even on their phone. Michael Corbell, who's now one of the top commercial directors, in the country, maybe in the world, does mostly car commercial, of course, and whatnot. He and his now wife had made really the first iPhone television series called Goldilocks when they were both in the master's program at USC. And Michael got his break basically because he did a spec commercial for Coca-Cola, and it was one, and sort of set his career off. But there's a guy, and Anna, his wife, has also made some feature films. So they started by just basically taking their iPhone and making a movie, and that movie got a zillion views, and they were off to the races. So the same thing with a script. I mean, if you can take a scene from your script and shoot it and attach it, or you can do a great sizzle reel so that you can send an email to an agent with a 1 minute sizzle reel about what your script is about, and that they don't have to sit and read 110 pages from an unknown writer that's going to go through it. If best, it's going to go through a 22-year-old reader in the mailroom, and sort of hopefully channel itself up to someone who can make a decision. If you put a minute sizzle reel that you cut together on through iMovie or Final Cut Pro or whatever systems you use on Premiere, someone takes a look at a minute piece, they go, oh, that's a great idea, send the script along. So those are the kind of things you have to be thinking about, I think, as a young filmmaker is, what's going to give you the leg up? What's going to separate you from the rest of the group? Those are the things I would encourage young filmmakers to do today. But also to do your homework. Watch old movies. Understand scene structure. Understand how good
so
movies
important.
Plot drives, character drives the movie, and plot doesn't drive the movie. And so you get invested in your career. Understand all that stuff. Understand what makes it work by doing your homework and becoming knowledgeable about the business you want to get into. And I don't think that old movies are 1990 movies. I'm talking about go back into the 20th century and take a look at the 15 or 20 great films and keep moving through the 70s and then get yourself up to today and see why old storylines still work out today, even event films, because they're not that many. They're not really that many stories, premises to stories. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. those underdog guy gets thrown out and he hits the bottom and he comes back and he survives and evolves. I mean, so you start to see those things going right back to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And so do your homework.
Don't
be lazy.
There are really no new plot lines, but there are lots of ways to come at them.
Absolutely.
And I was going to ask you if you had a piece of advice for anybody, but you just gave us two giant ones, so I don't really need to ask that question. Those are fantastic pieces of advice.
Well, as I said to you yesterday, I wrote to you yesterday, it's funny because when I was at the FI in 1979, 80, and the first day that all these wannabe young filmmakers from around the world came to meet Tony Villani, who was the chairman of the film department, and we were all in this room, and we all had done already some sort of film. I'd done documentaries, and we were very serious about our craft and what we wanted to do, and went to AFI because we thought it would help us with our careers. And so Tony says to the group, he says, the only thing I will promise you that what will happen to you in film school is by the end of the term you will be older. and so that's it. I mean, the rest of it is luck, talent, aggressiveness, ambition, networking, all those sort of things. Finding people who can go through life with you.
Some of which you can control.
Studio agency secretaries.
Right. Some of those things you can control.
Those are the people who are going to become the sellers as they move up through the ranks.
And
find those people.
Right.
And attach yourself to them.
I was saying that
they'll be your friends and they'll be able to help you get along as you move on through your life. I'm still friends, with people I came up with a business with. The fact is that we're all in our 60s, and most of the people, who ran studios are long out of the business, who I was friends with. But it benefited me for a good part of my life in the business.
Well, a certain amount of it you have control over it, and some of it you don't. You don't really control luck, but I ascribe to Thomas Jefferson's maxim that the harder you work, the luckier you get. But you can't control that part of it, but you got to have some of it. It's not all just hard work, because that's not the end of it. It has to be shown to the right people at the right time and all those good things.
Well, if you have a second, I'll tell you the luckiest thing that happened to me.
Sure.
All right, it was back in the 80s, and I had developed a story, a motorcycle story, sort of like a Rockiest story, and about motorcycle racing in Europe. And I was unable to sell the script, and a producer came into Columbia, and Robert Lawrence, who's the executive at Columbia, and he had submitted a number of really horrendous pieces of material. And he was related to Tricia Levine. He was married to Tricia Levine, who was the daughter of Joseph E. Levine, the producer.
Right.
So they were a little bit helpful to him. They sort of indulged him. And so he came into the office one day, and Bob Lawrence said, John, stop bringing me these horrible scripts. Everything you send me is just unreadable. He says, you see those scripts over there, and they're 50 scripts lined up on the floor, piled up. He says, every one of those scripts we're not going to do. And any one of those scripts, pick any one of those scripts, and they're better than anything that you've ever sent me. So this producer walks over there and he pulls out a script, and it's my script.
Oh.
And that movie gets made. And so that's the luckiest thing that could ever happen.
Wow, that is.
And at the same time, I've had two movies that were greenlit, ready to go to production, and the studio presidents either were fired or they left to go to another studio, and as a new executive came in, they cleaned house, and those movies didn't get made.
Ugh.
So and that has nothing to do with the material. It just has to do with usually new executives do not want to make old executives' films because there's no upside to them. If it fails, it's their fault, and if it's successful, it's the other guy's success.
Right. So that's been around in Hollywood forever. When a new regime comes in, they pretty much sweep house of what's sitting there.
Right.
Which is
there's a lot of luck in this business, and there's a lot of there's a lot of good luck, and there's some good luck, and there's a lot of bad luck.
Yeah, well, and a lot of hard work. So, we've been talking for a little longer than I thought we were going to talk today. We're up to almost 50 minutes. For the listeners, I want you to know that we've been listening to Rocky Lang, who's been a very successful writer, director, producer for a long time in Hollywood. If you want to know more about Rocky and what he has in his world, do visit rockylang.com, and you can also check out my very first interview with him right here on StoryBeat. Rocky, this has been just another terrific chat, and I greatly appreciate you coming on the show today.
I always love being on your show and talking to you. You ask very, very good questions. It's fun to talk to you. Thank you.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.